Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's time for our Bible class again today, and today we will continue, if you will, the work we started on Daniel chapter 7. Okay. So we will take our time today and see how well we can get through most of the material. And if we need to stop without coming to an end, we will, because I think it's important that we just understand all that is presented here as we go forward. As we have done in the past, I want to ask that we offer a word of prayer before we begin. And so I ask you to just bow your heads with me wherever you are. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to study your word and to really understand the truths that you have given to us in the scriptures. As we study, Lord, we pray that you would really open our hearts and minds and allow your spirit to really guide us in everything that we say and do. May we truly appreciate all that you have laid out for us in your scriptures, and may we truly understand by the prompting of your Holy Spirit as our prayer in Jesus' most holy name. Amen. Okay, so we have started as of last week a dual stream on both YouTube and Facebook, and I'm hoping that the resolution is pretty good. I looked at the YouTube resolution and I felt it could be a lot better, so something we'll monitor this week, and if it continues that way and it's blurry and you're not seeing clearly, then we will revert to what we've done in the past. All right, so that is something that those of you who are looking at YouTube, if you have any concerns, you can always send us a message and we will look to make an adjustment next week. If you're comfortable with how it is, then fine, we can keep going. So welcome again. This week we are covering Daniel chapter 7. It is a very interesting chapter in the Bible and one that gives us a lot of insights into the prophetic work of God, especially with respect to the Roman Empire and how the Roman Empire affected Christianity, both in good ways and in bad ways. And we'll talk about that today. What I wanted to really just establish very quickly as we get into this message today is to recognize that this book, if you will, or these visions to Daniel, this particular vision was given, as we studied last week, around 553 BC, but yet still, even though it was that far in time, it gave very clear insights and stuff that will occur into more than 1,000 years AD after Christ, and way down into the 18th century. And I find that very phenomenal. So that while we go through figures and numbers and stuff, I want you to keep in mind that this is an example of God's ability, if you will, to really demonstrate his prophetic power and his span of creation from the beginning to the end. All right, so just keep that in mind. Keep in mind that this is indeed a phenomenal bit of prophecy, and we shouldn't take it for granted. And we should really appreciate that this is something that is really special that God has done with his people over a period of time. All right, so let's get into our screen, if you will. And so I want to begin by sharing our screen, and let's get straight into our slides, which will carry us through our activities for today. So today we are looking at lesson 11 in our series, which we started around April the 4th. So we have really advanced a lot of ways, and we'll continue to go and push forward until we get to the end. So today we are really covering religious Rome, which is the little horn of Daniel chapter 7. And we continue the theme that God has a plan. That is always going to be a recurring theme in our heads, that God has a plan for us and it is not haphazard, and that he is doing what is required to get us into a good place. All right, so we're looking at religious Rome as the little horn of Daniel chapter 7. As we go forward, I thought it's important to recognize that if we are going to interpret Daniel chapter 7, and one of the things we discussed earlier is that as we interpret Daniel chapter 7, it's important to recognize that Daniel chapter 7 does not occur in isolation, and rather there is a context, and the context, of course, would be the visions that went before, and in particular the vision that came in Daniel chapter 2. So a few weeks ago, we had spent a lot of time going through Daniel chapter 2, and we had developed a very good understanding of the span of world kingdoms. And when I say world kingdoms, we know that we are using that to talk about kingdoms that occurred around the Mesopotamian valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates River and around the Mediterranean Sea. That is fundamentally where the theater of action is taking place, all right? So in doing that, we have established that we saw a span, if you will, of kingdoms that will occur in that region. And as we looked at that, we felt that in understanding those, which was very, very clear, we can see a parallel, if you will, between what is occurring in Daniel chapter 7 and what is occurring in Daniel chapter 2. And that is not surprising, because as we go along in all the prophetic works, we realize that what we experience in prophecy when we study prophecy is a term that we have used in the past. It's called progressive elaboration. In other words, God is progressively revealing more and more, so that the more we study, the more we understand. All right, and that is really important. So in terms of the Daniel chapter 7, I just wanted to lay down some markers so that we all appreciate where we are, right? First of all, Daniel 7 is the last chapter that was written in Aramaic, because we knew that the book was written in both Aramaic and Hebrew. And so this is the last Aramaic chapter, which was, of course, the contemporary language of the day. And then it is a parallel to Daniel chapter 2. He is again shown the empires, but he's shown the empires insofar as they affect God's people. So while Daniel chapter 2 would have been, I like to call it, and that's just my classification, more the political sequencing and succession of kingdoms. In Daniel chapter 7, we have the same political sequencing and succession, but it is focused heavily on the way those kingdoms affected God's people, and in particular, the last kingdom, which is the Roman Empire. So again, this is now real revision for those of you who have been with us from the beginning, and those of you who are joining late. Along the way, you'll have at least known we covered this. We talked about the fact that the prophecy or the vision that was received by Daniel in chapter 2 covered the succession of kingdoms from Babylon all the way to divided Europe, which is today. All right, so today Europe is certainly not a homogeneous kingdom. It is made up of many different kingdoms that have come together to form what we call Europe today. But each nation within Europe has its own sovereignty and its own particular culture, etc. So the French and the Germans are completely different, and some of them, in most cases, have their own languages as well. So clearly, this is a divided Europe, but it is still Europe, because it's still the lands that surround the Mediterranean basin or the Mediterranean Sea. So what we saw in Daniel chapter, and again, this is a historicist view of prophecy. It assumes that the prophecy is unfolding from the time of the prophet all the way to the end. So we have Babylon, which was the kingdom in rule when Daniel was captured, and that kingdom gave way to the Medes and the Persians, who then gave way to the Greek gods, the Greek nations, led by Alexander the Great and his generals, and then Rome, which had a lot of different leaders and emperors along the way, and really span a long period of time to where we are today, where we are living in the modern day times of a divided Europe. And that these kingdoms and the successions of these kingdoms were represented, if you will, by the fact that the image had different metals that made up different parts of the body. And as you traverse the metals from the head of gold to the feet of iron and clay, it was meant to correspond, if you will, with the succession of kingdoms along the Mesopotamian valley. And that would have covered Babylon all the way to the divided Europe. That was pretty straightforward. And then we were discussing, as we looked at what was really clear in that prophecy, was that one day God will come, and we know that if the stone represents God's kingdom, it hit the image at its feet, which means that God will establish his kingdom in a period of divided Europe, and it will last forever. That should give us some assurance as people who today we are looking for crisis coming. This is an assurance that we are living in a time when we can really say crisis coming is soon, because the image suggested and the dream suggested that God's image will be established around this time. As always, feel free to stop me and ask any questions as we move along, but let's keep going. So when we get to Daniel chapter 7, what we identified was 4 beasts, which we covered in some detail last week, and so I won't really spend a lot of time on this week, because we'll come back to show it corresponds to the kingdoms that are shown in Daniel chapter 2. We'll talk a little bit today about a little horn that was part of the 4th kingdom that emerged. There's a judgment scene that appears in Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 to 12, and we'll talk about that next week. And then inside of there are portrayals of the Son of Man. We want to talk about that and his role and function in the context of a judgment. And then we'll talk about this, who are the saints of the Most High, who are repeatedly referred to in the book of Daniel. All right, so those are the things to look forward to as we go on from this week to the next. I assume that the YouTube people are seeing okay, and I know for sure it looks like the Facebook resolution is pretty good. So let's keep going as we go forward. So again, this is just brief review. Daniel is asleep. This is now 553 BC. It is in the 1st year of King Belshazzar. Nebuchadnezzar has been dead. Belshazzar is a co-regent. He shares the kingdom with Nebuchadnezzar. So he is asleep. Daniel is asleep in a kingdom where the Babylonian Empire is in decline. Daniel is concerned about what will happen to God's people and when will they return to Jerusalem and return to their own land. And God is gracious enough to give him a vision that builds upon the earlier vision that Nebuchadnezzar has. And I want us to appreciate that the God we serve is a God who, when we are troubled and concerned, he is willing to give us direction, and he's willing to reveal his way to us. And let me say to you today that I know some of you, sometimes we say, well, I'm waiting for a dream from God. God has revealed a lot already in the Bible, and he has revealed a lot in the writings of a lot of the Bible commentators and those who are inspired, and some who believe are prophetic. And so there's a lot of literature and language and preaching and stuff available today so that you can understand God's direction. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get a dream for you to know what God wants you to do. And if he chooses to do that, great. But in the case of Daniel, there was not a proliferation of literature and language and people preaching in his day. What he had to rely on were the prophecies of Jeremiah, the older prophets, who had said that they would only be in Babylon for 70 years. And on the basis of that, because remember their country was destroyed and they were now in a foreign land, he remembered those prophecies and he was concerned about what their future will be. So God gave him the vision. He saw 4 animals, a winged lion, if you will, a lopsided bear with three bones in its mouth. He saw a 4-headed leopard that was also winged, which again suggested rapidity and speed. And then he saw a beast that really defied description. It wasn't one that conformed to the normal animal kingdom, so he just called it a beast. He couldn't really find a name for it. And just to note that some commentators, and I just put it out there so that it could resonate with you if you wish, and it could have some meanings to you. Some commentators have said that when God first made man in the Garden of Eden, he gave man dominion over the animals. Of course, man sinned, and they were put out of the garden, and they had to kill the animals and stuff in sacrifice, which we studied before. But clearly, the world went awry from what God had expected. And so the representation of the kingdoms of the world as beasts may be ironic in that it is suggesting that while God's intention was that man would control the beasts, he's suggesting that if you move away from God, then you take on more beastly nature rather than God's nature. So that's just something to lay in front of your thinking so that you can have a better appreciation of how symbolic it is that God is representing the kingdoms of the earth as beasts, when his expectation was that the kingdoms of the earth should really be manly in their qualities and really reflection of God's image, because man was made in the image of God. But what this is kind of subtly suggesting, subliminally suggesting, I would add, is that given the fact that mankind has moved away from God, he has become more beastly in his nature as opposed to godly in his nature. And that is not far-fetched as a conclusion, because we are all aware that these kingdoms really persecuted and killed a lot of people. And one could argue that in that instance alone, they are more beastly in their nature than they are human in their nature. All right? So that is just a little bit of trivia that I wanted to leave with you, because I think it makes a good way for you to remember that the beast representation were really representation of kingdoms that existed in the earth. All right, so again, this is more review at this stage. We did this last week. We were very clear that the winged lion represented the Babylonian Empire. Just as the head of gold represented Babylon, so the winged lion, it rose quickly. It is the king of all beasts. It represents a powerful nation, etc. That is a fair expectation. So Babylon, which had its demise in 539 BC, and this vision is taken in 553. So there's some years yet before Babylon is eventually destroyed by the Medes and the Persians. What we find here is that the representation of Babylon, both as a head of gold and the king of the beasts, is really representing Babylon as the kingdom. That is what the prophetic symbol is meant to depict, if you will. And that the use of wings are suggesting that they occurred quite rapidly, which we know, having studied the chapter before, and all the times we spend discussing the Babylonian Empire, that this is a reasonable conclusion, because indeed and in truth and in fact, Babylon rose quickly under Nebuchadnezzar's leadership. Leaving Babylon, we know that Cyrus the Great, and I keep reminding you of his name because he was predicted by Isaiah, the prophet. Jesus predicted, God predicted that Cyrus would come. So Cyrus the Great and Darius the Mede. Cyrus was a Persian, Darius was a Mede, and they formed an alliance called the Medes and the Persians, which eventually became more known as the Persians, because the Persians were the stronger of the two members of the partnership, if you will. And over time, we found that was happened. We know that for the Medo-Persian Empire to come forward, they had to destroy Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. So that was what these three ribs were when they meant to signify. And if a bear holds these ribs in its mouth, it's meaning to crush it and eat it up. So those were not simple transitions. They were transitions that occurred through war and through real battles, if you will, to get to the point where the Medes and the Persians became the dominant kingdom. Succeeding the Medes and the Persians as they died out eventually, the Greeks, who at that time, and I must tell you, the Greeks were one of those who first believed in distributed leadership and democracy to some extent. I say democracy in quotes, if you will. The Greeks had developed these almost like a federal system where there were governors who would run various nations. And then after that had thrived for a while, there was a real effort by Alexander's father and then Alexander himself to unite all of Greece into one powerful nation. And that is exactly what Alexander did. And he rose extremely fast at a very young age, and he conquered a lot of ancient Mesopotamia as a young man. He died very early, and then his kingdom was divided into 4 generals. And one day, I think as we get into Daniel chapter 10 and 11, I will spend some time talking about that, because this is extremely important. 4 generals who took over his kingdom. I just want to say to you very quickly, and we can pick that up in further research, that these generals, when they split up the kingdom of Greece after Alexander's death, they allocated sections to themselves that was basically along the 4 cardinal points: east, west, north, and south. And later on, the ones to the east and the west, they kind of gave way, and you found that the kings who control, or the generals and their successors who controlled the north and the south, became the dominant parts of the empire. So much so that later on people refer to them as the Northern Empire and the Southern Empire. And the fulcrum, or the pivot, or the line by the reference point for north and south was actually the land of Israel. So Israel will sometimes say the kings of the north, and then they will say sometimes the kings of the south. The kings of the south are places like Egypt and Carthage, etc. The kings to the north were those who were in Turkey and in northern Babylon, etc. So that's just a little bit of, again, a little bit of trivia. And I want you to keep in mind that we will have at some point in time, and certainly when we get to Revelation, but by the time we get to Daniel chapter 11 and 12 and 10 to some extent, we will be talking about these 4 generals and how they split up the nation after the demise of Nebuchadnezzar. All right? And then we came to a beast that defied description. It was big, it was powerful, it had iron legs, if you will. It was destroying with teeth of iron, which was the Roman Empire. There was some very important characteristics around the Roman Empire, which is to suggest that this beast, not only was it strange and looking very different from its predecessors, it also seemed to have 10 horns. And as we look back in history, and we have a chance now, those of us who, well, all of us who are now living after the period in which this occurred, we can look back and realize how accurate this depiction is. Because in truth and in fact, Rome was different from the kingdoms of Alexander and the Medo-Persians and the Babylonians, in that Rome first, just like Greece to some extent, started off as a sort of federal system, and then they moved into emperor-type rule. So whoever, a few generals who became strong enough, and we had people like Romulus and others, they kind of control Rome. And then they went back into a senatorial type affair. Rome had introduced the Senate and the parliament type system, and people talking and representing areas, etc. And then along with Julius Caesar, where we talk about, those of you who have studied the classical literature, you know about Julius Caesar and Brutus and his betrayal. Julius Caesar and his ascension. What we found is that with that, you really had a situation where Rome became more of a monarchy all over again, with an emperor who would control all of Rome. But Rome existed along the, and I'll come to the map a little bit later, but Rome existed along the lands that made up the perimeter of the Mediterranean Sea. And consequently, what would have happened would be that the barbarian tribes, some of them people refer to them as the Germanic tribes, so the tribes that live on the extremities of the Mediterranean Sea, more inland. They were barbaric, they were not controlled by any system of governance, etc. They were simply tribes, and the survival of the fittest occurred among that group. They would, from time to time, invade areas on the perimeter of Rome, and it is reasonable to conclude that there were, by the time we got to AD 476, and this started even before that, but by the time we got to AD 476, it is reasonable to conclude that 10 barbarian tribes had effectively taken over the Roman Empire and brought, and by the way, the Western Roman Empire, and brought the Western Roman Empire to the end. I am making a deliberate distinction between the West and the East, because the Eastern Roman Empire, which was really in the area of Constantinople and what is now modern-day Turkey and Istanbul, etc., that continued for quite a number of years in a very secure environment. But in the West, which is really where Italy and Rome is today, Geneva and all those areas, and Macedonia and stuff, in the West, and then down to Spain and Portugal and all of that. In the West, the barbarian tribes, the Franks and the Alemannis, etc., and we'll come to those in a while, they invaded Western Rome. And so when we say Rome from 168 BC to AD 476, I want you to bear in mind that we are really talking about Western Rome at this stage, because Eastern Rome continued for a while. But we'll discuss all that in a bit as we get into some detail around this. So these are the summary sections, if you will, based on last week. If there are any questions, I will take them at this point in time, and if not, we can move on. Any questions? Everybody's okay? You all feel comfortable? All right. Great. So now that you have the parallelism very clear in your head, and you can see the connection between Daniel 7 and Daniel chapter 2, it's important to spend some time focusing on not the 10 horns, because we understood what those were, but later on the prophecy went on to talk about a little horn that emerged out of the beast, and in emerging, he had some very important characteristics. He was far different from the other horns. So once we hear a horn, given the fact that we have attributed the 10 horns to represent 10 nations, it is reasonable to assume that this little horn is also a representation of some sort of political power that will emerge out of the Roman Empire. And because it's coming out of the beast, we can also conclude that it is going to be very Romanish, if I can use that word. I can coin it just for today. It will be very Romanish in its behaviors, in its characteristics, in its whole genetics, if you will. It is going to be a Roman power, but it's going to be a Roman power with a difference. And if you just keep that in your head, we are ready to move on to the emergence of the little horn in the fourth beast. So the text, I will quote it very quickly, says, I was considering the horns, and there was another one, a little horn, right? And there was another one, a little one, coming out from among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by their roots. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man. So he's saying that this kingdom or this political power seems to have eyes and a mouth like a man, and it was speaking pompous words. So that's interesting, because this is God giving the prophecy to Daniel, and Daniel interpreting the prophecy and suggesting that here is a kingdom or political power that emerges. I like to use the word metamorphose. It comes out of Rome. It still has the Roman DNA in it, but it is now speaking with the eyes of a man and a mouth speaking pompous things. And he's clearly, I mean, he didn't have to say that, because we can see it in this verse, but anyway, he makes a point. He says he shall be different from the first ones and shall subdue 3 kings, right? This is Daniel chapter 7, verse 24. So we're introduced to the beast in Daniel chapter 8, and in chapter 7, he gives us a bit more detail. He says he shall be different from the first ones, and he shall subdue 3 kings, and he shall speak pompous words against the Most High. We don't have to have much imagination to figure out that the Most High should be God from a Jewish perspective, because this is a Jew receiving a vision, which is Daniel. So when when he uses the term Most High, he must be thinking about God. So he's saying that and he's now personalizing the kingdom. So he's saying he's actually giving it a personification. So it is using a pronoun to represent it. He shall speak pompous words. Pompous, of course, means words that are outlandish and words that seem to have a sense of usurping the power of the one who the pompous words are against. So in this case, usurping the power of God against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High. That term comes up again. So not only are we meeting a Most High, but we're saying that the Most High will have saints. And I said to you, I think we discussed that maybe 2 weeks ago, that when the Bible uses the word saints, it is not the origin and the etymology of that word does not suggest that this is perfect human beings. It is simply those who are following and who have become converted and given their hearts and lives over to serving the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. So this is really a powerful little kingdom that is emerging here, where Daniel's vision is suggesting that it has some very important characteristics, right? And then it says further, because remember before, it says he shall persecute the saints of the Most High. I mean, if he's going to persecute the saints of the Most High, is that going to be forever? Is that going to be something he will always do throughout his kingdom? But then he concludes Daniel chapter 7, verse 25 by saying, then the saints, meaning those who is persecuted, shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. And we now need to deconstruct and demystify this particular prophecy so that we can appreciate what is taking place here and what are the main themes that are emerging in this prophecy. Always remember that when God gave Daniel the prophecies, he has given it to him as a sense of reassurance, and he's trying to suggest that even when things are bad, I still have a plan. And I can say that that is accurate in this regard, because here with us, we are seeing a beast that is very, very different, very ominous, very dangerous, but God is defining the time period in which he will have control. Now, this term for a time and times and half a time, I will come back to expand on it. But those of you who have been in this class for a while, if you remember, when we discussed the mad king, which was Daniel chapter 4, we said that Nebuchadnezzar, who was a king, that he would go mad for 7 years. And if you remember, that word years was not in the scriptures. What it says is that he will go mad, and I can give you the verse and you can look it up when you have your time. It's Daniel chapter 4, verse 16. It says, he will be mad for 7 times. All right? And even then, I said to you that word time is really a Hebrew word, an Aramic word, sorry, because this is Aramic, and it really means, and it roots, it means year. So we were able to quickly make the association, and if you read other translations of the Bible other than the King James Version, you realize that the Revised Standard Version, the English Standard Version, and even to a large extent the New International Version, they do not use that word time, they use year instead, right? So it is reasonable to say that Nebuchadnezzar was mad for 7 years. And I would want to suggest to you that in this phrase here, this which I like to refer to as an idiomatic phrase, in this phrase here, we are really talking about for a year and years and half a year. But don't take my word for it, just let it soak within you. We will come back and do a detail on this in another slide that is coming up soon enough. Everybody okay so far? Before I get into the details of who this beast is, I feel it's important to review Christianity during the Roman Empire. I feel that's important because sometimes we as Christians, and I dare say even Seventh-day Adventists, of which we are part, we are sometimes guilty of painting a very ghastly picture of the Roman Catholic Church without understanding the antecedents, the history of Christianity, and put it in that perspective. And I said to you, I'll give you a very quick synopsis here, but we'll go into it now, that if you, in those days, in the days of this Roman beast and the little horn, there was only one Christian church. As a matter of fact, it was called the Catholic Church because Catholic means universal. That's what the word Catholic means. So it's a universal church. It's a church that covers all of Christianity. And that was the original church. And later on, other churches grew out of that. And the most notable of that was Martin Luther and the Protestant movement that occurred in 1517. And from that, we had Methodists and Baptists and Pentecostals and Presbyterians and I dare say Seventh-day Adventists and other religions, right? So all of the religions that occurred out of the Protestant movement would have occurred out of the works of Martin Luther. But Martin Luther was not at that time in creating his schism, in creating his division from the main church. The main church continued, and it continued into what we know today as the Roman Catholic Church. As a matter of fact, the term Roman came as an adjective in front of Catholic to distinguish it from the Eastern Catholic Church, which we'll talk about, which is some of the, if you go to places like Russia and some of the, what is called the Coptic areas, you see an Eastern Orthodox Church that is very much looking like Catholicism, but it is not called Roman Catholicism because it didn't stay from Western Rome, if you will, right? So that's just a quick synopsis. Let's get into, so I thought it's important before we just jump in and say the little horn is this and little horn is that, that we appreciate the context and appreciate where we're coming from. So there's a little bit of history that's going to pop up here. It is by no means exhaustive. I'm not a historian by any stretch of the imagination, but it is going to give us, in very general and broad terms, an outline of what took place. And then hopefully from that, we can have a light bulb moment in our heads and say, oh, that is what it means, and that is how it applies. And then when you do it that way, you are less contradictory, because sometimes the way we put it across is almost as if we lay the sins of the present, of the past church and the present population and membership. And we are not saying that. We are saying that if you were to do that, then all of us are guilty, because the Christian church would have been the mother church of all of us, all right? So let's talk a little bit about that. So the first thing is, I just want to go back onto the geography of the region and tell you that when the Roman Empire, which was established around Christ's time, and this is where Judea is. So Judea is on the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea. It's a small strip of land, but this is where Jesus was born, grew up and died. And if you think about this small strip of land in the context of this whole continent, and continents, if you, because it includes the African continent. And if you think about this small strip of land and a humble man who was born in a manger and died on a cross, and how because of him the Christianity spread with such ferocity and with such speed that the whole world today, there are Christians all over the world, and they number in the billions. All right, and that all started with Jesus Christ. Christianity is not Judaism. Judaism was what we had coming from the Jews, and that still exists today. Christianity is different, all right? So that came with Jesus Christ. One of the things I wanted to appreciate is that Christianity spread so quickly because the Romans, as an empire, were very good at engineering and civil engineering in particular, and had established very good road networks and cities and good jurisprudence and governance. So people were able to move in and out freely and preach their messages and convert people to Christianity. And that's why Christianity moved with such speed. All right, in the New Testament, it is notably that in the book of Acts, the Christian church was taught about how it was spoken about in the book as to how fast the gospel spread. But I kind of go ahead of myself. Let me just reinforce what we know here. This is the Mediterranean Sea, and this is Western Rome, what is today known as Spain and Portugal, etc., and France and Germany, etc., and England up here. And then we have Northern Africa. All of this, these are the lands, if you will, that exist on the perimeter of the Mediterranean Sea. And then one of the things we said that if we drew an imaginary line here, then it's reasonable to conclude that there are some nations that are lying on this side of the line, which are primarily the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea, and those on the western side. And I know it's not equidistant, it doesn't look like equal halves, and I've done that deliberately because really a lot of these areas like Greece and stuff were considered to be part of Western Rome as opposed to Eastern Rome. On that basis, therefore, we will appreciate that some area is known as Western Rome, and then another area is known as Eastern Rome. One of the things and this is review for a lot of you, but let me just say, one of the things we did not discuss, and I'll say that to you now, is that Western Rome primarily spoke Latin, and those of you who have our parents and grandparents who grew up under colonialism will know that you had to study Latin at school. So Latin, which is primarily originating out of Italy, became the predominant language in Western Rome. And to a large extent, you could argue that even French and Spanish, their root is tied to Latin. Matter of fact, I have been told when I went to secondary school and even in university, that some people tell you if you knew Latin, then French and Spanish came very easily because the whole grammatic rules and structure of Latin form the basis of the variations, if you will, that emerge as Spanish and French, and to a lesser extent German and stuff, right? And then to the east of Rome, they were using more Greek language, right? So the language of the Turks and the Jews and stuff was less Latin and more Greek on the other side. That is a little bit of trivia that I want you to keep. Those things are important when we start to deal with that. This is really to say that out of this little strip of land here on the eastern seashore of the Mediterranean Sea, Christianity grew to the four corners of the world. It reminds me of a passage that Jesus told his disciples, go and baptize men in the four nations of the world, in Judea, Samaria, and to the uttermost ends of the earth. And if you just think about that, think about the size of this empire, and think about the fact that ordinary, humble man who died on a cross and was born in a manger started a movement that has now populated the world and controlled it to a large extent and permeated and found its way into all of Western Rome and certainly Eastern Rome as well, right? So that to me is extremely important. Having said that, I want to establish some key points. I want to say to you that Daniel's vision purposely presented Rome a one-sided version of Rome, and that is because of what Rome did. But before we get into the bad things of Rome, I like to talk about the good things, and maybe that's something you must learn in your own life, that when you go about to criticize people and give them a dress down for something they did, maybe it's good to first find some good things that they did before you get to the bad things. So let's talk, and interestingly, when we get to Revelation chapters 2 and 3, and we see God giving messages to 7 churches in Asia Minor, which is around the Turkey area. He does that same structure, if you will. He first says something good about the church, and then he says what he has a concern around. So I think that is, we have good precedent, if you will, for recognizing the good in others, even as we tell them about some of the shortcomings and things that they need to do, if that is a role that we have to play, right? So some good things about Rome. Rome gave paved roads. They gave an advanced system of law and jurisprudence. Even today, lawyers use Latin terms to describe certain aspects of the law that they learn that has its roots in the Roman Empire. And then the Romans gave us something called Pax Romana, which was a period, almost 2 centuries of peace. And that Roman peace is what allowed Christianity to flow so easily and to find itself established in various areas, right? So that to me is extremely important, and I thought I should mention that to you. Now, I want us to also remember that the Apostle Paul, who is the writer of books like Romans, Galatians, Thessalonians, Corinthians, a whole lot, maybe the majority of the New Testament. Paul was a prolific writer. Paul was also a Roman citizen. Acts 22 tells us that Paul, when they were beating Paul said to the centurion that stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? And when the centurion knew that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, take heed what you do. This man is a Roman. And the chief captain came and said to him, tell me, are thou a Roman? And he said, yes. And the chief captain answered and said, with a great sum obtained this freedom. And Paul says, no, I didn't buy, because people could have buy their citizenship as a Roman. Paul said, no, let me be very clear. I was free from birth. I was born a Roman. So that was something, right? And straight away, they departed from him because they felt very afraid that they had persecuted a Roman citizen, which is really the wrong thing to do in those days because the Romans protected their people, right? And then in Romans chapter 13, Paul himself praised the Romans. He says, for this cause, pay tribute. In other words, pay your taxes, for they are God's ministers. Paul was saying that about the Romans. So I think it's important just to establish that while the Bible deliberately portrays Rome as a terrible and dreadful beast, we must appreciate that some good things came out of Rome and that the Apostle Paul recognized their value and encouraged his followers to treat Rome with respect and treat them with authority. If that is the case, then we must begin to ask ourselves, why is Rome portrayed so dreadfully? And that is what we'll get to, right? Revelation chapter 12 and Daniel chapter 7, they present Rome as terrible and dreadful. All right, so let's talk about that for a bit. So even though Rome was good, they were portrayed as dreadful because of the way they treated the Christians. I just put in that statement outside there. It comes from the book God Cares by Mervyn Maxwell. He actually uses that phrase, but it's picked up by a lot of other Bible commentators as well. So I thought to say that maybe as parents and as leaders, you need to remember that even though you provide everything that the people need, or your children need, or your family needs, if you treat them badly, then you're still bad in the sight of God. You know, I thought about some of the domestic violence situations we had. We had one with a young girl last week, a young lady who was 37 years, with a guy who was 57 years. And this was his second domestic violence murder, I could call it that. I mean, in the last one, he was convicted of manslaughter, but this is really murder. And the fact is, when you read the story, the girl told her friends that when he is not drunk, he's such a nice guy and he looks after everything for her. But then when he gets drunk, he gets really bad. The Romans were bad even without being drunk. So the Romans, even though they looked after the people and they took care of everything and they provided these great highways and villages and cities and places to live, and the standard of living was great, and they were able to manage blacksmiths with iron and stuff. They were a great nation, and we still have remnants of Rome today in our bicameral parliamentary system of Senate and lower house. We still follow a lot of their various ways and their systems. The fact is that they treated the Christians really badly, and that is what God is attempting to represent in the book of Daniel. And I think that is important that we all appreciate that is the change that is taking place, right? Paul himself, we talk about Paul being a Roman soldier, a Roman citizen. Paul himself was persecuted. Paul also told Timothy in his counsel to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, he says, all who follow Christ shall be persecuted. In other words, the Roman persecution by the time of Paul and some of the apostles, and we know that, I mean, history tells us that all of the disciples and the apostles died terrible deaths. Why would they kill hanging upside down, thrown into barrels of hot oil, beheaded, etc.? Paul himself was beheaded. Why was that happening? Because the Roman nation persecuted Christians and the true believers of Christ. So that is once you begin to appreciate that, you begin to understand why it is the Daniel prophecy portrays Rome in such a terrible and dreadful manner, because God is saying, don't care how good you look, if you treat my people badly, then I'm going to frown upon that, because that is not what I expect, right? Now, it's important to note that so I have a question. Somebody says, somebody's asking something that we'll have to deal with later, right? Because I'm trying to not make the connection. But let's talk about that. The question is, what does the beast in Revelation 13, who has 7 heads and 10 horns, which comes out of the sea, represent? So there are some easy giveaways in that, right? The first of all is that it came from the sea, and the second of all, it had 10 heads, 10 horns, or 7 heads and 10 horns, right? So once you see that, you begin to realize that there must be some parallelism between Revelation 13 and Daniel chapter 7. But I want you to hold on that, because some of the things we're explaining in Daniel chapter 7 can be better understood when you get into Revelation and you read some of the other chapters. But I'm trying not to confuse everybody, and I want us to progressively get to where we are. So we're going to kind of use what we have so far. But to answer the question, I think that's good, because one of the things you will learn, and that's why when you study prophecy, it is useful to study Daniel and Revelation together. Because one of the things you begin to realize is that there's a lot of parallelism and a lot of support for each other. And we need to remember that. Getting back to the slide, let me just remind you that one of the things you need to remember is that Paul, not only did he say that they would be persecuted, but Paul talked about something else. He says that this is the text we used last week. And I just want to go back it again. Paul says, take heed of yourself. And I told you it was Jesus last week, so I'm making a correction. It was Paul. This was just before Paul left the people he was talking to at the time, and he himself will be crucified. He says, therefore, take heed of yourselves and all the flock among you, which the Holy Spirit had made you overseers to shepherd the church, which he purchased with his own blood. For I know this, that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. From among yourselves men will rise up, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after themselves. So Paul is talking to the Christians, the early Christians, and he's saying, in addition to the persecution which he himself went through and which he told Timothy everybody will go through, he's saying that, and I will want to put the word out now, he's saying that apostasy, which is really a rebellion of what is the truth and not believing what is truth by the scriptures, apostasy will arise within the church, because he's saying men from among yourselves will rise up, speaking perverse things. So Paul is predicting, if you will, that not only will there be persecution, but there would be apostasy. Now, I want you to appreciate that Paul is a Roman living in the time of the Roman Empire. So if he gives a warning about persecution and a warning about apostasy, then clearly Paul is saying that persecution and apostasy will occur during the time of the Roman Empire. All right, and without saying much more than that, I can argue that he's also alluding to the fact that it will occur with the blessings of the Roman Empire. That is something that we really need to pay attention to. So I'm saying, let me just summarize where we are at this point in time. Rome did some great things. It was a powerful nation, a powerful empire, and we have a lot of legacy stuff that we have gained, waterways and stuff in Europe and Venice and that kind of thing from the Romans, and from the ability to make canals and highways, etc., and join communities and nations and carry information and that kind of thing. But the Romans were also very, very vicious as persecutors of God's people and people who were faithful to the original gospel according to Jesus Christ. And as a result, God paints them in a very bad way, deliberately, which kind of tells us something that God, you cannot bribe God. You cannot be so good that God will ignore your bad. He is saying that if your bad is against what I have said, then I see that more than I see your good stuff. And your good stuff don't come for nothing, because we cannot earn our salvation. Our salvation comes when we accept what Christ has done for us. And that was classical Martin Luther you just got there, right? All right, so let's go on. So let's talk about the persecution that the Romans did. Because I want to suggest to you that both the Roman Empire and the Roman Church, and I can easily say here the Catholic Church. I don't need to put Roman, I just need to say the Catholic Church, because at that time that was the only Christian church, was universal Christian church. So they did some persecution, right? First of all, there was some, what we like to call some methodical persecutions under one, Nero. Nero, we talked about that before in AD 60, when Rome was burnt. Nero blamed the Christians for that, and he sent a lot of Christians to their death, burned to the stake, thrown to animals, put in the dungeons, etc. In AD 250, we had Decius. He was also another Roman emperor who methodically, for a few years, tried to destroy the Christians and had them persecuted. So the true Christians were, well, not even then. Wasn't even about true Christians. He was just anti-Christians, because Christianity wasn't considered to be the Roman religion at that point in time. And so they were running in the mountains and the dungeons, etc. And then we had Diocletian, who for 10 years, he ran a real intense campaign against the Christians. So there is historical evidence and fact that the Roman Empire, certainly in the first centuries, persecuted Christians. That is clear. So persecution is clear. And then we had what is important to appreciate, that not only did they persecute Christians, but they created a cloud of fear of persecution, because the persecutions were so dreadful that people felt very fearful to be a Christian. And so that in itself created some drama among the people, right? And then with the ascension of Constantine, just around AD 313, after he saw the vision of the cross and he thought he had won because of that, the official persecution of Christians subsided. And I made that very deliberate sentence to suggest the official persecution subsided, so that the Roman army and legions were no longer persecuting Christians. And Constantine declared that Christianity should be a religion that would be spared of all this drama, and it should now allow to be officially coexist with all the others. And because he felt that he saw a cross, he wanted to curry favor, my word, Christianity. So he did a lot of things to make them the official religion. But it's important to know that after Constantine, the Christian empire, because the empire became Christian, so all of this time there were multiple religions existing, from the barbarians and others, etc. They persecuted Christians who remained loyal to their faith. So there was now, if you will, a dichotomy among Christianity. There were the Christians who were officially part of the kingdom and who supported the official religion of Christianity. And then you had the Christians who were maintaining the purity of what they understood to be the gospel and what God wanted of them. And they were considered to be the true believers, and they lived in the shadows. They lived in the mountains, in the rocks, in the dungeons. They were persecuted. So that community thrived, and they preserved the word of God, and they preserved the translation of the Bible from Latin into other languages, etc. over the years. But they were living in the shadows under persecution. And I suggest to you that they were later on persecuted by the official Christian church, because they were seen as being different from the Christian church, right? So having said that, I want to suggest to you that I just want to lay some key points down the road, that apostasy and persecution became two of the main things that came out of the Roman Empire. So if they are seen as the people who apostatized and who changed what the Bible and the early Christians believed, which is what Paul was cautioning against in Acts chapter 20. Then we are saying that in truth and in fact, Rome is best known for its apostasy and its impurity and its contamination of the pure gospel of the disciples. And it was also known for its persecution, right? So the other thing I wanted to just, and again, these are very quick summaries. We'll come back to it in a bit. Let me just summarize our timeline. The Christian church, the official Christian church, it became a religio-political power. So take that word down and keep it. I know a lot of you like to use papal and pagan Rome. I want to be clear that it wasn't just papal. It was a religio-political power. By the way, I could just drop that as a trivia again as we go along to let it secure in your mental consciousness. Today, the head of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, whichever word you wish to use, the head of the church is also a head of state, because the Vatican by 1929, after Mussolini would have created some alliances and some arrangements within Italy, the Vatican is seen as a country. So when the Pope visited, and he visited the Caribbean some years ago, he visited any other nation, he's afforded head of state significance. It's a small state. The Vatican is really just a small area that is stamped within Italy and within Rome itself. So it's like a city that has country status, a country within a country. But the fact is, he is the only religious leader who is afforded, at least from all I could consider him, even the Buddha, I think, yeah. So he's maybe the only religious leader who has a political title, head of state. So in a way, we are this religio-political occurrence that occurred in the early Christian church is not unique, because we have seen it even today where it occurred. But in the case of the Romans, after the real Roman Empire declined, and we talk about that, when the Roman Empire declined, what we saw emerging was the Christian church. And as the Christian church emerged, it became more prominent and it became very powerful. And that church influenced the Western Rome and to a large extent Eastern Rome from the 6th century, around 476 or even after that, or 538, all the way to the 19th century, right? And then, well, we talk about the French Revolution after. The point I want to also remind you is that the Roman Catholic Church was the Christian church for about 1,000 years, and is the mother church of all of us, all modern day Christians, right? And then the shift from simply calling it a Catholic church, because Catholic means universal, to Roman Catholic occurred when the Roman Empire was declining and being invaded by the Germanic tribes. So when the tribes were coming in order to identify the church a little bit more specifically, it was referred to as the Roman Catholic Church. These are key points. I just want to let that soak in. It seems like a random point, but it becomes important as we start to interpret the little horn and figure out how it works, right? The other thing I wanted to remind you is our little graph that we've been using, or chart we've been using over and over again, to suggest to you that there was only one holy Catholic and apostolic church, right? So that was what it was seen as for centuries. So this is the New Testament era. This is after Christ in the early centuries. And somewhere around here, we have Constantine, 330, right? So then you have ecumenical councils, because Constantine is trying to get the Christians to become the dominant religion. He is giving them a lot of opportunity to hold their councils with other religions and try to incorporate what they believe and try to find an accommodation. Constantine himself is also trying to unite the kingdom. And so he makes Sunday an official day of worship and rest, more so a day of rest, and then the day of worship came after. But already, and I should just say something about that here. One of the things that the Jews did was that the Jews, even in crisis time, the way the Jews observed the Sabbath, the 7-day Sabbath, it was really burdensome. I mean, the Jews had laws that says how far you could wash your hand, how far you could walk. Remember when Christ had healed some people on the Sabbath day. And when they went before the Jewish leaders said to them, who healed you on the Sabbath day? Because you're not supposed to heal people on the Sabbath day, which is a crazy thing if you think about it, right? So all in all, there was this view, if you will, that the Jews had made this Sabbath burdensome. So in that regard, a lot of the early Christians almost kind of naturally started to come and worship and hold services on the first day of the week, in addition to going to the synagogue on the seventh day of the week. So they basically had two worship services. They went and observed the Sabbath on the seventh day, but because it was so burdensome, they also naturally held a more relaxed and enjoyable service on the first day of the week, which was Sunday. And so when Constantine came and he realized, by that time the Jews used to call it the 8th day of the week, or some of the other people used to call it the 8th day of the week, but the Jews always kept a 7-day week. When he realized that some of the pagan or barbarian tribes were believers in the sun god, in fact, Constantine himself come from a family that worshipped the sun. He then found an opportunity for some sort of ecumenical or unison there to say, well, we all believe in this day, let's make it a day of worship and a day of protection and a day of support, right? And so for a time, both days were observed, but then as the Christian church became more and more entrenched and more established, it soon moved from just a secular observance of Sunday to a religious observance of Sunday. And we had what we can very well call our early Sunday laws that were spiritual in nature, that forced people to observe the first day of the week as a Sabbath day. So under Rome, there was this shift, if you will, that gradually pushed the first day of the week as a day of observance rather than the traditional 7-day Sabbath. And so people were quite willing to move away from the 7-day Sabbath because the Jews had made it burdensome, but there were always true believers who said, no, that is what the commandment said, a 7-day Sabbath, and therefore we'll observe that. And the church even made some modifications to the commandments so that emphasis on the 7-day Sabbath was de-emphasized, if you will, and what was given prominence was the first day of the week. That is history. That has nothing to do with my perspective as a Seventh-day Adventist or something. That's straight historical fact, right? So that is born out there. Matter of fact, this is a very generic slide that came. So what we then had was at around 1054, so we had what the eastern areas of Rome kind of went there one way, and the western side of Rome continued into what we refer to as the Roman Catholic Church. And then you had Luther in 1517, so you had the Lutherans form, and then you had other Protestants coming out of that. You had Henry VIII, who wanted to divorce his wife and marry another woman, and the church refused. He then formed his own church, the Anglican Church, the East English Catholic as it was then known. And then all of that continued, and so the Roman Catholic Church really is the remnant, if you will, if I could use that word, coming out of what was the one Christian church at the time, of which all of us can claim some kind of inheritance to that period going back then, right? So I thought I would make sure that we have that balance in how we present this thing. The other thing that we discussed before was that the early Christian and the early Romans, and then the Christians who became leaders within the Roman Empire, they practiced what we have dubbed syncretism, which is that they incorporated stuff from the other religions into their own religion and found it acceptable. And then they lived in a period of emperor worship. This is important, because when the real or the civil Roman Empire declined and the Roman Church started to ascend, when the Roman Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, or the head of the church, became more of a religio-political power, then he naturally assumed that he should have the same level of worship and stature of him as a person, just as how the emperors who worship, like Constantine and Diocletian and Justinian, etc. That is extremely important when we get to speak things against the Most High. We talk about that, right? So that is also important. And the last part I wanted to just leave with you in terms of trivia is to remind you that the early teachings of Luther, when Luther laid his 95 theses on the wall, there are about 3 things that Luther sort of established. The first is salvation is only by faith. Luther said you couldn't do good deeds to earn forgiveness. The church couldn't make you do penance, etc. You couldn't pay for indulgences. What comes for you in salvation is by faith. If you believe in Christ and you have faith in Christ, that gives you salvation, right? And that was extremely important. The other thing is he came up with something that even today is popular, and our pastor loves to use it in church. It's called sola scriptura. In other words, he said the Bible and the Bible alone. Now, the fact that Luther had to say this is really testimony to the fact that by 1517, which is when he placed this, right, 16th century, the church had developed a number of teachings and a number of rituals and practices that were not based on the Bible. I mean, that is just reverse engineering, right? If it is, he has to come back and say to us, the Bible and the Bible alone, then it is reasonable to conclude, and that is historically true as well, that the church had become so inculcated with a new culture that the teachings of the priests and the Pope and the leaders of the church and the bishops took greater prominence than the Bible in itself. And that's something we need to always be careful against, that we must never put the teachings of man ahead of the scriptures, all right? So that's important. And then the other thing he said was that once we are all achieving our salvation by faith, then everybody is equal. And no human priest could interpret the Bible for you or intercede on your behalf. So Luther really revolutionized what was by then thousands years of practices that were well entrenched, where people would go to the priest and they would pay for their indulgences, etc. Luther laid that to waste, all right? So we head into 4 o'clock, and I'll see at what point we stop, but I think we are covering some good ground, but we have a lot of way to go, and I don't think we'll do all today, so we just see how far we can pick up to this point. Any questions at this point? These were just some summary facts to just keep us focused as we go forward, right? I want to return quickly, very quickly, to our timeline that we proposed, right? We said that in the before Christ era, we had the Roman Empire with Julius Caesar. Then we had Jesus Christ, who lived during Roman period. The Romans are the ones who killed Jesus Christ. Then Nero, after Christ died, Nero would have been having his persecution of Christians in AD 60. In AD 70, Jerusalem was destroyed. That was a marker, a huge marker. And then beyond the destruction of Jerusalem and using Pax Romana, the fact that there is peace in Rome and that it has this great infrastructure and roadways and canals, etc. The Christianity spread and the church grew, but there were always frequent periods of persecution, right? And then we had Diocletian, who, just like Nero, practiced a very systematic form of persecution of Christians, because the Christians who had emerged out of the life of Jesus Christ, they had learned that they really shouldn't pay homage to no emperor as if he's a god. The only God is God in heaven, etc. And so because they were not blending in and they were not being syncretized, they were not amalgamated to what was being presented, they were persecuted. We then had Constantine himself coming into power in AD 313. He saw the cross when he was about to fight, and because he saw a vision of the cross, he said Christianity, God had blessed him, and so he became a Christian himself, and he gave great power to the church and gave the church a lot of legitimacy and stopped all the persecution and all that kind of thing, right? So the church gained prominence under Constantine, but he was constantly influencing the church. So what then happened was that because Constantine wanted unity, the church started to amend and modify some of what it believed to accommodate, if you will, some of the nations who were conquered into the Roman Empire. Hence the word syncretism, and hence the labor of apostasy. As why Paul says, from among you, there will come those who are speaking strange things. So all of a sudden, the church started to, well, not all of a sudden, but gradually, the church started to pay for indulgences, and you can ask for forgiveness, and people will be the priests in front of you, even though they're supposed to be Jesus Christ as your intercessor. And then this was also a period when and this is an important point I want to make today, when the barbarians were invading the Roman nation at the perimeters and the boundaries. So people were dying regularly. And because of all this debt, the church was constantly, there one writer, I think it was Maxwell, he said the church was constantly burying people. And as a result of having these many funerals, the church had to find ways in which it needed to give people comfort. And soon you found a syncretization, if you will, of the beliefs in life after death. And so you had all this talk about purgatory and being able to move your soul from one point to the next. Just from there that you had this view that when people died, they went immediately into heaven because it gave them a sense of comfort that maybe their relatives were in a better place and all that kind of thing. So a lot of what was traditional Christian beliefs out of Paul and the apostles and Jesus Christ, etc., now found a sort of change and modification occurring, and it represented a whole level of apostasy, even while persecution was taking place. So always remember that the Romans were the APs. They were apostatizers and persecutors, right? And if that is in your head, you need to remember that. So by now, by AD 476, Western Rome is declining. It is no longer a political power, but Eastern Rome is still in play. So because Western Rome is declining and the barbarians have invaded, over time, as the years went on, an emperor called Justinian, he comes into play, and he is living in Constantinople on the east, but he says, well, we can't just give up the west. So as the barbarians come in, Justinian forms different alliances and agreements, but more importantly, because the church was the most Roman thing in the West, because when the barbarians have been invaded, they destroyed all the political and judicial structures of Rome. But what remained intact was the Christian church. So the Bishop of Rome became more and more powerful, and then Justinian granted him, the Bishop of Rome, civil power. And that is where that term religiopolitical comes into being, because what it then says is that the Roman, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, he not only had religious power, but he had political power. So I wanted to contrast that, if you will, for the period when Constantine was in play. Constantine was the emperor, the Bishop of Rome was in charge of the church. And the Bishop of Rome and the emperor worked a lot together and tried to make some changes. But that time, there were two separate entities. By the time we get to 538, what we find is that the emperor has been demolished and destroyed and decimated by the barbarians. And these barbarians are all over the place and they run anything how they want. But the church has become prominent. And as a result, the Bishop of Rome now has not just religious power, but political power, all coming together into him as one person. So here you have a unitization of church and state that is occurring through one leader, as opposed to a unitization of church and state that occurred under Constantine, where you had two leaders. That is really, really important and symbolic, because it says that under this one leader, he is both emperor and spiritual leader, which is really, really interesting, all right? And there's story, short history, we can talk about that. Continuing on, I told you that Eastern Rome continued. We talk about Islam starting up in the East around 570, and then from 538, all through the Bishop of Rome, he is now lending his support, not just to the West, but to the East as well. And then you have Luther, who would have started this Protestant movement in 1517. And then by 1798, the French Revolution is in full cry. And one of the consequences of the French Revolution is that they want to bring an end to the influence of the church. And so they capture the Pope and they put him in jail and he dies there by a general called Berthier, right? I told you that during this period, when the church has political as well as spiritual power, and of course by this time here when the church is destroyed, it loses its political power. During that period, however, the official church persecutes the true church, right? And true believers, they live in the shadows, and the word of God is preserved during this period, right? So those are some key points that we want to establish. And we talked about the American independence occurred around that same time. So I think I want to stop here. And when we come back next week, we pick up from this here, unless you guys really, really want to go forward. But my plan is to kind of stop here. Just maybe talk about the identifying marks and then we stop, right? So I want you to realize that this religio-political Rome is the little horn of the fourth beast of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire is the beast itself, the barbarians are the 10 horns, and then after the 10 horns, we have the emergence of a little horn. Maybe we just pick that up before we close off. Somebody is sending me a message. Let me see what it says. Somebody said, let's go, man. Let's go, man. Yeah, you could talk that. They show me how it change. All right, let's keep going. All right, so let's go. So let's talk about, so I want to let a slide soak into your mind, right? I'm saying to you that the religio, and as you tell me, using religio-political because he has both religious power and political power, which is the church, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, who emerges as the leader of the nation and the church after the barbarians. After the barbarians. I wanted to keep in my mind that word. After the barbarians. The barbarians have invaded through 10 tribes. They've caused real drama. Rome is in shambles. Justinian is the bishop. And he says, whoa, what has happened to the West? Boy? How can we maintain some semblance of control down there? He says, I know what I'll do. I'll make the Bishop of Rome, give him political power, and we'll support him with armies and with legions, etc. So all the Roman legions in the West now took their command, if you will, from the Bishop of Rome, right? And he is the one who controls this stuff. So let's see what happens here, right? So there are some identifying marks, if you will, which we looked at in Romans, in Daniel chapter, but we pick up the chapter, we pick up the verses, chapter 7, right? So the identifying marks we said in verse 8 and 24, we said that this little horn will rise out of the fourth beast. The fourth beast is Rome. So the little horn should come out of Rome. Religio-political Rome came out of Rome. Check. Appeared after the 10 horns. That's what verse 24 told us. Religio-political Rome came after the barbarians had invaded Rome. Check. It started off small, but rose to be bigger than its fellows. Check. Religious Rome started off small as a church and then got political power and then soon controlled not just the West, but the East as well, because the emperors in the East started to take their spiritual direction from the Bishop of Rome in the West. So he had real control. He is bigger than any barbarian or any horn. This is a really powerful kingdom, right? Check. It was put down 3 kings, so that 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. So that was something you remember we talked about. We said a little horn, for it to come up, it will have to pluck up 3 kings so that it should reign. And maybe that is what we will close off with today. Let's talk about that, right? So I want you to appreciate that the 10 barbarian tribes, so this is the Mediterranean Sea down here, and the 10 barbarian tribes that invaded Rome and took over sections of Rome. Remember, all this was Rome before. The Suevi, the Visigoths, the Heruli, the Vandals, Burgundians, Franks, Anglo-Saxons, Alemanni, Ostrogoths, Lombards. These are some of the tribes and where they were situated. I don't have to tell you, but you could tell that the Franks eventually became the French. The Anglo-Saxons is well known as a terminology for the people in the UK. So that is where they ended up. And well, of course, this is the area of what is today known as Spain and Portugal, right? And then this is Italy here, which is what we know. And then we have northern Africa at the time. Carthage and Tunisia was known then, but they soon, we'll talk about that in a bit. The Alemanni are the ones who eventually became modern-day Germany, right? So we'll talk about that. So I want to just get a good sense of where the 10 tribes are located, and you get a sense of that. Now notice that this is what occurs, right? So this is how they all become what are the modern-day nations of Europe. This is classical feet and toes in Daniel chapter 2. However, there's a little footnote here that says that these three barbarian tribes, Heruli, Vandals, Ostrogoths, they are now extinct. So we just taken note that there are 3 of them that no longer exist, because we know for the little horn to become powerful, he has to put down, he has to demolish, he has to overcome 3 horns. What do you know? Coincidentally, as we equate the 10 tribes that were the predominant, and by the way, there would have been more tribes, but these were the predominant fellows who were coming in. These 10 tribes who invaded Rome and brought an end to civil Rome and to political Rome, and they became the modern-day nations. What do you know? 3 of them are no longer in existence, right? Even though all the others can find legitimacy in current European nations, we can't do the same with the Vandals, the Heruli, and the Ostrogoths. Let's go back into our story. So it's important to note that if you do any history of Christianity, it is fair game, and I've done a lot of that talking here, but I'll just go it over, that the Roman Empire gradually gave way to Christianity, gradually, right? Constantine moved the capital of the empire from Rome to Constantinople to the east. He then added greatly to the stature of the Roman bishop in the west, and it made the Roman Empire Christian. So under Constantine, the whole Roman Empire was deemed to be Christian. Around 376, which was about 100 years before 476, the 10 tribes started to invade. Now I want you to pay attention to this here. Some of the tribes were what you would call, so some of them were what we call nominal Christians. Because even though they were tribes living on the perimeter of Rome and the Mediterranean Sea, Christianity was reaching out to some of those areas, and some of them were accepted. And then with syncretism, they were given opportunities to come back and join part of the church, etc. However, there were a few tribes who practiced what is called Arianism, and they were known as Arians. You know that word Aryan when we talk Hitler, who talked about the Aryan race. That's our next story. But anyway, in those days, there were some who were called Arians as opposed to Catholics because of Christianity. Because the Arians believed that Jesus was not God and he was a created being. Well, that is not unique. Even today, our Muslim brothers and sisters believe that Jesus was a prophet, created being, as opposed to a God. So here were the Arians who believed that, right? Now, that was a real concern for the Bishop of Rome, because while Christianity was growing, this kind of offshoot religion was taking its prominence, right? So look what happened, right? In 487 AD, a Catholic emperor called Zeno, he signed a treaty with the Ostrogoths. And when they came together, they destroyed the Heruli. who were Aryans. So they went and they licked them up and they destroyed them. So by 493, there was no more Herodites, became extinct. Who is doing that? A Catholic emperor. But this is 487, right? So he is more and more Christian in his outlook, and he will eventually be succeeded by the Bishop of Rome, right? Christian Emperor Justinian, who we talked about before, he exterminated the Vandals, who were also Arians, second tribe Gauls, right? He did this in 534 AD, and he broke the power of the Arian Ostrogoths later on in 537. So between 487 and 537, three tribes who were Arian in their thinking, didn't believe Jesus was God, and therefore the church united with the political powers to destroy them. They were destroyed, and because they were destroyed, they created room for the Bishop of Rome to control things. So by 538 AD, when the Bishop of Rome was appointed as the head of Rome, there were no tribes to give him any pressure because the Heruli, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths, they had been destroyed. This couldn't be any clearer than representation of what occurred in the prophecies. And I'm saying to you that this is really representative of the fact that God is a powerful God who in 553 BC is predicting what will occur in 538 AD. And I really thank God for his ability to give us that influence. My last slide for today is to just let you know that we did 4 identifying marks so far. These 4, we said will arise out of the 4th beast. Yes. The religious political aspect of Rome, now headed by the Bishop of Rome, came out of Rome. It appeared after the 10 horns, yes. It started small but arose to be bigger than its fellows, yes. It was put down by 3, it was to put down 3 kings, so that 3 of the first ones were plucked up by the roots, and the answer for that is yes. So we've covered all of that, and we are now looking for the other 4 characteristics. I like to say that these first 4, and I don't like to move the slides too fast to get you to seeing things moving on your screen. But these first 4 characteristics are more around the civil authority of the little horn. In other words, in terms of how the little horn will come up as a political nation, it will come out from Rome, it will come out after the 10 horns, it will start off small but become big, and it will basically have to put down 3 kingdoms in order to become prominent. When we get to the other 4, however, which we'll start to cover next week, these are religiopolitical, religious and civil authority. I would say to you, it had eyes like the eyes of a man and mouth speaking great things. We need to ask ourselves, what is that? It will wear out the saints of the Most High. I could hint to you that is persecution, so that one is easy. It will think to change times and law. We need to see what that is. And it was allotted a special power. It's special power for a time, 2 times, and half a time. I told you a time could easily be replaced as a year. Let me look at Daniel chapter 4. So this is really for a year, 2 years, and half a year, and we'll come and talk about it. So this is where I want to stop for today. And I want to ask you to keep studying, because when we come back next week, we will want to finish. We have about, I will tell you now, we have about 25 slides. So I will want to finish. I will cover what is captured here. But you all right with that? Any questions? And for those of you who are always willing to make sure that you understand everything, I have a poll today, right? So I know I got some feedback from some people who say they don't like the polls, but I have some feedback from some who say they like the polls because it gives them a chance to just test their knowledge and reinforce the points. So we'll stop here today. No audio? Somebody say no audio. Will I hear me? Will I hear me, right? I think I'm getting the audio coming through. Yeah, you're hearing me. Because I'm hearing my. Hello? Testing, 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 testing. Yeah, audio is coming through. All right, so we want thanks, Nigel. So we'll want to do a quick poll, which I'll put up for the Zoom people. And then for the YouTube people, I will put up a PowerPoint presentation. I will also show the poll. So let me just do that quickly. Right. So yeah, I think I'll get cussed to this, yes, but we're gonna do it, right? So let's go again. So let's go. So this is our first poll question. Put your pens on paper and just make sure you're all ready. So we're gonna take our first question, and it says, and those of you on YouTube, on Zoom, you can actually start to answer your poll questions on the Zoom platform, all right? So you can use that as a way of checking where you are and just hitting next and moving forward. So the first question is, how many beasts did Daniel see in his dream recorded in Daniel chapter 7? Was it 12, 144, 3, or 4? So you're having a chance to answer that question. Those of you can think about that. How many beasts did Daniel see in his dream recorded in the in Daniel chapter 7? What type of beast represented the Roman kingdom? Somebody answered on YouTube, so everybody's seen it. What type of beast represented the Roman kingdom in Daniel chapter 7? Was it a lion? Was it a leopard? Was it a beast was unlike any known beast? Or was it a bear? Again, you can answer on Zoom. And if you're YouTube, you can take a note because we'll come back and give the answers in a bit, right? The third question, just make sure the YouTube people get to see all of this and understand it. Right. So people answering on YouTube, make sure you all think you get it right, and our Zoom attendees, you can keep going, right? And tell me how much questions you answer. All right. So the third question is, where was the Roman kingdom located? Was the Roman kingdom located in South Africa? Was it between Cedros and Labre? In the lands around the Mediterranean Sea? Or was it in North America? You pick a number and tell me where you think it was located, right? Right. So YouTube, I like my YouTube team, they're answering off the bat. I like that. So keep your numbers going, keep your notes and kind of know where you are. All right. Oh, I forgot a fifth one, which was Italy. I didn't put that one, right? So that was it. Let's keep going. Which kingdom reigned when Jesus lived on earth? Was it China? Was it United States of America? Was it Assyria? Was it Rome? Or was it Babylon? Which kingdom reigned when Jesus lived upon the earth? Right, so that is what we're trying to answer at this point in time. Which kingdom reigned? Keep check out your answers on your questions so that you can kind of do that. Sister Marge, you are really shooting up on YouTube there and put up all your answers. We'll check them at the end and see if they're all correct, right? All right, so I think we've seen that one for a while. Let's go now to the next question. Zoomers, the ones on Zoom participants, I'm hoping that you could use your screens and answer your questions, right? The Roman Emperor Constantine converted to what religion in the 4th century AD? Right, it's around AD 313. What religion did Constantine convert to? Was it Buddhism? Was it Islam? Was it Christianity? Was it Judaism? Was it Rastafari? Which religion did he convert to? This is your chance to try to answer the questions, right? So keep going, keep going. You all are doing well. Zoomers, you need to answer so that we can keep seeing your questions coming up, right? Sister Marge, you're answering the questions, and Sister Callista, you are both going neck and neck. Let's see how it goes. All right, the Roman Empire evolved into two parts known as Northern Rome and Southern Rome, upstream and downstream Rome, Eastern Rome and Western Rome, uptown Rome and downtown Rome. Which one is the correct answer? What did Rome Empire evolve into? Was it Northern Rome and Southern Rome, upstream Rome and downstream Rome, or Eastern Rome and Western Rome, or uptown Rome and downtown Rome, right? So that is your question. Zoomers, you need to take some part in this question here, all right? In all the questions. Some of you are answering more than one. These are all single answer questions, I think, at this stage anyway. Let's see what's going on. All right. The other question is, what evolved from Rome after the fall of Western Rome in 476 AD? So the nation of Rome in the West would have been destroyed and fell. And what evolved after that? You all need to tell me. Was it a pile of rubbish after the nation was destroyed? Was it a pile of rubbish? Was it a pride of lions who now roam and control the area? Was it the Christian church and its head, the Bishop of Rome or the Pope? Was it Islam? What emerged after the fall of Western Rome in 476 AD? And my YouTubers are really in full cry and answering all the questions, right? So, all right, let's keep going. Zoomers, you need to follow out your poll on your screen. All right, what year did the French Revolution crush the Church of Rome, and how was it done? Right. So, what year did the French Revolution crush the Church of Rome, and how was it done? And I saw some people love the Rastafari answer in one of the previous questions, but let me stay with it once here. I'm glad you like that, right? And some people actually answered and said yes to Rastafari. So maybe it's the man who commented on YouTube. The Zoomers are not hearing, but I had a few Zoomers. Deborah, check your settings, because I had a few Zoom people who came back and said that they were hearing me. So maybe something is up with your Zoom connection, right? So what year did the French Revolution crush the Church of Rome, and how was it done? Was it 2020 with the coronavirus in Italy? That was how the French Revolution crushed the church. 1947 when Germany was defeated. 1517 when Martin Luther posted his 95 thesis on the door of the church. Or 1798 when the Pope was taken prisoner and died in prison. Right, so somebody has asked a question, which I think we answered last week, as to what was the significance of the four beasts coming out of the sea. Last week when we discussed prophetic symbols, we said that sea, based on our reference in Revelation, sea represents a place of a lot of people. So the fact that the four beasts came out of the sea means that they were coming out of heavily populated areas, which is around the Mediterranean Sea and the Fertile Crescent, or the Mesopotamian area, right? So that is the significance of the fact that the four beasts came out of the sea, and I hope you all appreciated that, right? So let's go now. What year? Oh, are we supposed to answer what year? I hope you can answer that. Right. So my YouTubers are moving all along fine and Dandy, let's see if we can keep this going. The ninth question, just 10 questions. We have the Little Horn Kingdom emerged from which kingdom? And there was still a form of that kingdom. And there is, that should be still. That should be is, sorry, my mistake. There is still a form of that kingdom. The Little Horn Kingdom emerged from which kingdom? And there is still a form of that kingdom existing today. So, A, was it Babylon? B, was it Rome? C, was it Greece? D, was it the French Revolution? Which kingdom did it emerge from? Or E, was it Media Persia, right? So you need to just tell me which one it emerged from and where it landed. And I know some of you are asking about the answers. We'll come up with the answers in just a bit, so you all have answers to the question, right? And then the last one says, which of the following is not included in the description and actions of the little horn? It arises out of the 10 horns of the fourth beast. It will seek to change times and laws. It will have eyes like the eyes of a man. It will ensure peace between Israel and Palestine. It will wear out or persecute the saints of the Most High. Which one is not in the description of the little horn in Daniel chapter 7? All right, so I want to, from a poll point of view, I want to end the poll on Zoom, and then I want to continue with the presentation if we need to give the answers to the questions of those of you who are checking, right? So I have had a few results well submitted on the Zoom. I'm giving you a little bit more time just to close that off. And then I will end the Zoom answers here. I can share the results if you wish, so you can see what you did on the Zoom side of things, and those on YouTube will see you. How many beasts did Daniel record in his vision? A lot of you said 4. What type of beast represented the Roman kingdom? Most of you said the beast that was unknown, but some said the lion and some said the bear. Where was the Roman kingdom located? Some of you said in the lands of, somebody said Italy. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. But let me just go to the screen now and answer the questions, right? So let's go. How many beasts did Daniel see in his dream? And the answer, of course, is 4. So all of you got that. What type of beast represented the Roman kingdom in Daniel? It wasn't a lion. Lion was Babylon. It wasn't a leopard. That was Greece. It was sea. The beast was unlike any other known beast, right? YouTubers, that is coming your way. Where was the Roman kingdom located? It wasn't certainly between Sidros and Labre. It was sea in the lands around the Mediterranean Sea. Which kingdom reigned when Jesus lived on earth? That one is easy. It's Rome. Caesar Augustus ruled in Rome when Jesus was there. So I hope a lot of you are getting that right. Roman Emperor Constantine converted to what religion? Dave, I know you like Rastafari, but unfortunately it was Christianity. But it's good to know that you would have liked him to be a Rastafari, right? That was Selassie. So he converted to Christianity. And I saw people on YouTube also, on Facebook also, trying to answer some of the questions. But we will hopefully, they are now seeing the responses, right? Roman emperors divided into 2 known parts, and we talk about that a lot. Eastern Rome and Western Rome. This is important, everyone, because a lot of times, again, when we present Rome, we like to talk about Western Rome as if that was the only part of Rome. And we forget there was an Eastern Rome that eventually was known as the Byzantine Empire, all right? And that is important. What evolved from Rome after the fall of the Western Rome in 476? It was a Christian church and its head, the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope. All right? So that one was good. What year did the French Revolution crush the Church of Rome, and how was it done? And that was in 1798 when the Pope was taken prisoner and he died in prison. The Little Horn Kingdom emerged from which kingdom? And there is, sorry, I should have said is, that was a mistake. There is still a form of that kingdom. And the answer, of course, is Rome. And then number 10, which of the following is not included? And there was nothing about it ensuring peace between Israel and Palestine. So those are our questions. Let me just quickly say to our friends on Zoom that I have launched these polls as anonymous. So I do not see your particular scores, and therefore I cannot tell you what you scored. You will have to kind of check that yourselves. But thank you all for participating. I really thought that was a good way to end today and get us into the groove. So understand where we are at. We have covered, if you will, all the political signs of who Little Horn is. And now we need to move to the religious political signs about the Little Horn and what he's doing and what he's causing to happen. I thought we had a good session today. I saw you all are very quiet, but I'm hoping it's because you understood more than you were confused. We have employed repeatability in a lot of these presentations where I've repeated a lot of stuff that I have said in one form or the other before, because I'm hoping that the more we repeat it, is the more it stays with each and every one of us. All right? So thank you all. If there are no questions, we will continue next week where we will finish off the Little Horn. Maybe it's fitting that we take 2 sessions to cover the Little Horn because this has been a pivotal prophecy. Let me just give you a little heads up that when we get to Revelation, our understanding of the Little Horn and its role will be key to understand some of the key prophecies in the book of Revelation. All right, so if it is, we understand what is happening here with Rome and Babylon, then we should be able to see that going forward. Happy Father's Day to all the fathers. Somebody reminded me that I need to tell the fathers Happy Father's Day. So Happy Father's Day to all the fathers, as we did with all the mothers some time ago. And I know the fathers will have, and father figures will have a glorious day tomorrow. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of sports on the TV to look at, but I know there are other things that you can pay attention to. And tomorrow, our church pastor, Pastor Patrick Roy, is leading the worship services on the Point Fortin SDA, on the SDA YouTube channel, Zoom Church, tomorrow afternoon at 6, and then the South Caribbean Conference continues to host a crusade-like virtual conference that takes place this evening, I think at this evening at 6:30, and I will continue during the rest of the week as well. So thank you all for participating today. Thank you for your attention and your support and your enthusiasm with respect to the polls. Some people still like the polls, Deborah. So let's keep at it for a bit. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for your word. We thank you for this wonderful prophecy that told us about what will happen way before it actually happened. But more importantly, it tells us that you are still in charge and you have a plan. And so, Lord, even today when we may experience difficulties in our lives, maybe we remember that the same God who had a plan to see his saints and his people through persecution and apostasy and to keep his church alive is the same God who is with us today and is able to see us through. Bless us and guide us, and may we have a good week is our prayer in Jesus' most holy name. Amen.